The world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today we have the honor of connecting with Azeem Azhar, the brain behind the Exponential View newsletter and podcast. How to describe Azeem? Thinker, writer, advisor, technologist, former founder. After studying politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, Azeem has pursued a career spanning journalism, venture investing, machine learning, natural language processing, entrepreneurship, and advisory. In addition to his work on the Exponential View, Azeem is an advisor to the CTO of Accenture, as well as a number of AI companies, including Onfido and Reinfer, both of which we've had on the podcast. He's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Digital Economy and Society, and an investor and advisor through Anthemis and Kindred Capital. Azeem has written for The Guardian, The Economist, and the FT, and been featured in too many news outlets to count. In 2009, Azeem founded Peer Index, which processed social data using machine learning to identify novel, actionable signals. The company was acquired by Brandwatch in 2014. As if all of that weren't enough, Azeem is also an advisory board member for the Harvard Business Review. I'd highly recommend everyone subscribe to Azeem's insanely insightful newsletter, The Exponential View. He also runs a podcast by that name, which has featured some incredible guests, including author Yuval Harari, an economist, investor, and former Warburg Pincus vice chairman Bill Janeway. Check out Azeem's work at exponentialview.co. If you enjoyed today's episode or find it valuable in any way, I humbly request that you give it a quick rating on iTunes or your podcast platform of choice. That simple step can have a massive impact on our ability to connect with interested listeners. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please welcome Azeem Azhar. Azeem Azhar, welcome to Rebank.
It's great to be here. Thank you. You've put me in a really posh-looking office as well.
Oh well, we try to keep it classy, keep it high end. And certainly for a guest like you, with the kind of level of perspective, I think that you bring to a lot of the points, the conversations that we get into on a regular basis on the podcast. Certainly Rebank from a kind of a fintech perspective. Looking at technology convergence and how it's kind of impacting financial services and related industries. And I think you probably take that one step further and look at a lot of the social and political and economic implications of the same kind of technological convergences. Maybe just quick intro on you, the Exponential View, and some of the other work you do.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. Posh office aside, I've been in the tech industry for nearly 25 years. It's really where I started when I graduated university, and I am a child of the microcomputer revolution. I first saw microcomputer in 1979 when my next door neighbor showed up with something. I don't know what it is. I'm figuring it was a Z80 based build yourself your own little computer. It may have been a 6502 based one. And so I've grown up with technology and microcomputers and then the internet. And so I feel very fortunate to have had that sort of ringside seat where I can watch it happen and also participate. Having built a company that was acquired about 4 years ago now. I now split my time, spend a lot of it thinking about some of the issues that I've seen around where technology is going and how it's going to impact society. And I do that through my newsletter, Exponential View, which you can find through your search engine of choice, Google or DuckDuckGo. And I also spent some time with advising the Chief Technology Officer of Accenture, which is the world's largest professional services firm, doing some interesting work in this area. And I'm a venture partner at a London-based seed fund. So I get a chance to look at things at the very small and the very early, which is the sort of seed, and the very large, which is the large corporates. And then I also tie it together through the work that I've been doing through the newsletter.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, so you referred to the work that you do with Anthemis. So we definitely know Anthemis, and clearly a focus on fintech from that standpoint. And I think you're also an advisor to a company that we had on the podcast just recently, Ed Chalice of Reinfer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I met Ed and Marius, his co-founder, probably 4 years ago, and I'm thinking it's in Berlin. It was in Berlin at a Seed Camp event, and they were really just getting off the ground, applying some of their PhD work where they had been at UCL, which was related to text analysis and some novel approaches to text analysis. Reinfer is a super interesting company in the space that it's tackling, which is that within the middle office operations, particularly in kind of capital markets, lots of the processes are still run through email and Microsoft Outlook, and automating those processes or even analyzing what's going on, effectively trade reconciliation tickets and little corrections like that, has traditionally, with typical natural language processing techniques, been quite difficult. Those techniques tend to need rather more sort of textual data. And the work that Ed had done was really about extracting and structuring those short snippets of unstructured data. And what that then allows you to do, of course, is to look at these flows, figure out what's going wrong, what's going right, and ultimately start to automate them. So it's quite an interesting space. It's not one I had known about when I met them. They've worked incredibly hard to find that particular use case, and now that they found it, you sit and you look and think, hey, how come we didn't think about that before?
So you also run a podcast.
Yes.
Is it called the Exponential View podcast?
It's all called the Exponential View because I just ran out of ideas. Frankly, we threw around some other names.
I would argue you're directing your creative capacity in other directions than naming, perhaps, because the quality of your newsletter is phenomenal.
Thank you.
The depth depth of thought that goes into every one, plus the other writing you're doing. You've had some amazing guests on. I think you've all Noah Harari at one point. Great episode, and you just launched season 2 of the podcast. And I wanted to pick up on something, I think it was in the little introduction that you did to season 2, and describing what it was all about. You said, quote, "We are witnessing a wholesale rewriting of the rules of the global economy under the force of technology." And that's what season 2 of your podcast will cover. It's also what a lot of your current writing looks at. You've written recently about this kind of growing tension interplay between kind of international corporate sovereignty, the likes of the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, who are kind of to an increasing extent imposing the will on national governments, with the kind of traditional national sovereignty. I wonder if you want to just kind of open us up by talking a bit about this concept of global economy and how you see it evolving.
Yeah, well, it's such a confusing and complicated time right now, and I didn't use the word wholesale without thinking quite hard about it. And what I'm starting to see is that when I talk to people who are involved in the theory of politics or in looking at sort of democracies, they're coming out with books like How Democracy Ends and This Is How Democracy Dies and What Comes After Democracy. When you go and look at what's happening within the economics domain, you're starting to see a whole set of new theories of value coming out from Mariana Mazzucato and Kate Raworth. And then if you look in the technology domains, whether you talk to the kind of the CRISPR DNA scientists or the machine learning guys, or let alone the blockchain folk, everyone believes that progress is incredibly fast, faster than they've ever seen, and they're on the cusp of a change. That is a kind of combinatorial level of complexity that is about as far away from a static snapshot of the end of history, which we might have referred to 20 years ago, to this moment of a real febrile dynamism where we don't really know where paths are going to emerge. I think we have to overcome a set of beliefs that say that the world was in the rules were in a kind of naturally static point when we were born and when we grew up, a kind of inbuilt conservatism perhaps that we have. In the time that I've been alive, if you look at the value of companies on the S&P 500, the amount of value on the balance sheet that was apportioned to intangible assets, so not stuff that you can stub your toe on in a factory, but brand, know-how, intellectual property, customer goodwill, has risen from about 20% in the early 70s to around 80%, according to one firm called Ocean Tomo, which looks at this stuff. So we've transitioned in that 40-year period from a world that was physical, send the auditor around to the factory, count the number of boxes at the forklift and the number of forklift trucks, to a world where we're kind of ascribing value to stuff that you can't put your hands around. That's quite a significant transition, and that has all sorts of implications just in that one simple vignette on what company strategies look like, how they need to finance themselves, how you even account for this stuff, how you tax this stuff. And to my point about wholesale is that I'm seeing those sorts of classes of changes and challenge right across the board. If you look at the levels of populism at the moment that we see across the world, they are at the highest levels that we've seen since the 1930s in many, many different countries. Now, I'm not making a claim about history rerunning itself. Or the observation that I'm making is that 10 years ago, you wouldn't have found those levels of populism in countries that are as different as Brazil, the US, Turkey, Austria, Sweden, Hungary. But we are seeing that now. And that just makes for interesting times.
So picking up a couple of those kind of data points in the context of some of your recent, writing, it sounds like one of the concepts that you're kind of thinking about, or one of the questions that you're thinking about is whether, so we kind of lived in this world where, democracy has kind of prevailed as, arguably the most functional form of government, over the past, 50, 100 years. Capitalism on the economic structure side. Are we, as a result of technological developments and interestingly some of the social changes, attention span, this kind of everything we've seen, Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, right. Kind of a lack of a population which seems capable of making good decisions. Are we getting to a point where we need to be questioning, whether this democratic capitalistic paradigm is the right one or the only one? I'm going to start you off with a softball.
Yeah, that was a soft question. I want to, because it goes in two directions. So the first thing I think we have to recognize is that even at the height of democracy's heights, only about half of the world's population lived under democracies anyway, and arguably total market capitalism didn't really exist. And again, in a very, very large portion of the world, we just tend to, live and listen in places where those things do work and where things are really, really functional. But I think even, as a European, if you looked at US politics, even 10 or 15 years ago, I studied American politics as one of my courses at university. And back then, this is 1992, gerrymandering in 92, which is when you fiddle with congressional districts in order to maintain a majority, seemed really, really absurd. And the level of gerrymandering just seemed anti-democratic in 92, and it just got worse and worse and worse in the sort of subsequent 25 years. So let's first of all, I think, take stock and say, for all the strengths of kind of democratic-driven capitalism, it was still not a unanimous approach to how societies need to run. But then I think the second point is that the systems that we have are intimately related, as you pointed out, Will, to the technologies that we have, and the way in which we relate to each other is related also to the technologies that we have, and particularly the technologies that seem to matter are ones that relate to energy and energy provision and communication. So you couldn't imagine having a democratic capitalist society at the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, because you didn't have the communication level of education that you would need to have an informed electorate that could kind of come and form a view. And there were too many beliefs that were grounded in the supernatural at the time. And equally, you couldn't expect to have communism and central planning without modern communications and travel technologies, because how could you centrally plan if it took you 6.5 months to get information from the periphery of your state as to what the production requirement was? So, and even with those technologies of the telephone and radio, they didn't do a particularly good job of it. So I think we have to recognize that the way in which we establish these sort of civic capabilities, which are related to our attitudes towards religion and the kind of voting system that we have and the economic arrangements we have, are intimately connected to the technology bedrock upon which all of this is built. And what seems to be happening is that we're at that interesting phase change point where the technology bedrock looks really, really different. And the day we're recording this is the day after Bloomberg released a story that Chinese state intelligence groups had managed to infiltrate hacker chips into motherboards used by lots of American computer companies. In other words, these were hardware level hacks. Now that supply chain insecurity, which is what we can describe it, immediately threatens the notion of offshoring your production to a place of manufactures. And those are not challenges that were writ as large as this even 10 or 15 years ago. So I do look at these situations and say this is not to say we should replace capitalism with state planning. No one is suggesting that. It's really more to take a critical view of it and say, what do the rules now start to look like, given that there's been such a fundamental shift in the way the technologies are organized and what they can do?
Well, that last point that you made around supply chain insecurity, yeah. I think you euphemistically put it, it kind of gets onto another topic that I think you've spent some time looking at, which is kind of the concept of like a national AI strategy or a national quantum computing strategy. And I think you referenced recently some moves by the Chinese government to really set out an investment plan to support the ideally, I think from their standpoint, dominance in the quantum computing space by China. I think the U.S. has done something similar. Europe has done something similar. How do you think about this evolution of like an increasingly nationalistic approach to technology?
Well, I mean,
and provocatively, we had kind of nuclear arms races 50 years ago, Cold War and all the rest. Are we looking at something potentially similar?
I'm a child of the 70s, and it was the age of Aquarius. I remember living in fear in the early 80s of sort of nuclear annihilation, and we were worried about it with the strength of the USSR, the SS-20s, the fact that the American deterrent forces had fallen into a bit of disrepute and the American armed forces were reeling from Vietnam, and Reagan came along with the cruise missiles and the Pershing IIs, and recreated the MAD, mutually assured deterrence destruction sort of shield, and then. But technology came along as this sort of liberating force, the bicycle of the mind, and was going to create this sort of kumbaya global happy community. And certainly I would love that. That would be really nice. And we could all have dogs and, go for long walks in the forest.
It kind of feels like that we were there for a moment, right? With like kind of Google being kind of international, Facebook being kind of international.
It felt like, we're about to get there. People were very rapidly drinking kind of Kool-Aid. And of course, then I think it dawned reasonably quickly, and there were certainly some much smarter, more thoughtful critics of all of this than me from many different domains throughout the late 90s and mid 90s, saying this isn't how things will play out. And I think now you've got this really interesting situation where what's distinct about digital technologies is that they are dual use compared to a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon, which is not dual use. It's kind of a military thing. Digital technologies are dual use. The most powerful supercomputers in the world are not sitting in the NSA. They're sitting in the Starbucks around the corner where 70 people have got iPhone X's. And so there is a challenge with this dual use technology where, especially as it starts to inveigle its way into the infrastructure. And it means that from a digital perspective, all of the strengths that digital gives us, it also constructs vulnerabilities. So in a non-hot war, in other words, a war where we don't actually see people dying in the streets, a state can exert pressure onto another state by putting its banking system or its water system or its electricity system under pressure. And I think that, both the situation with AVG, which was a Russian antivirus company, and what seems to be coming out, this recent story with China and motherboards, will increasingly encourage governments to say we need to have much better certification, if not our own homegrown technology capabilities. And so when you then look at something like the power of quantum computing, which is a kind of quadrillion-fold or more improvement, and actually completely different paradigm, frankly, for computing, you can understand why you don't want this highly optional technology. I mean, optional in the sense of optionalities it generates for you strategically as a nation or for your industries to be something that you have to buy. And so I think it's inevitable that we will see more attempts to build homegrown champions in this area. Now, there is some kind of silver lining to all of this. So one of the silver linings is that just, again, in the last couple of days before we recorded this interview, the Pentagon was indicating that it was going to allow NATO allies to use its cyber warfare capabilities. Now, that's a return to the rules-based order that we know that arose after World War II, and this idea of sharing things like this with your allies. And that, I think, is a kind of little positive wrinkle.
I mean, interestingly, that feels like as much Cold War as anything else. Like now, there's like this, increasing realignment of kind of West versus East again. Kind of sharing tools with allies, and certainly like political and economic in terms of alignments, schools of thought, not dissimilar to what we saw last century.
It's not dissimilar, but I think technology is also an enabler of walls, segmentation, and division. I mean, back in 1997, a colleague of mine wrote a book called The Death of Distance, and in it she made the point, and it was very true, that distance had been this incredible barrier and that telecoms technology was going to eliminate it. So you went from making very quick international phone calls to leaving Skype running for 6 hours with your cousin who lived 10,000 miles away. I mean, we would never have done that in 97. So it did, in some sense, kill distance. But I think the other thing that technology does is it doesn't do it. It emerges from this, is that it makes it easier to sort people into groups. And I don't mean that from a top-down way. It's the way that we tend to associate with ourselves. You hang out with your friends, not random people on Facebook. And there is... technology also starts to enable greater localism and less of a need to think in centralized terms. And I think that's quite exciting from a political mechanism. If you think about microgeneration or high-density urban farms, which mean you don't have to kind of bus your nutrients for your population in from another country, but they also then reduce the need for those long-range interrelationships that we've seen as a hallmark of globalization. And ING, which is a Dutch bank, one of their equity analysts looked at the impact of 3D printing as a technology on global trade. This was a report back, I think, in 2016. I hadn't really given much thought to this, but the thing with 3D printing is that if you can produce the item you need locally, then all you need is the energy and the feedstock. And so there, in their model, obviously they had three scenarios. It's a bank, but every scenario where 3D printing sort of started to mature as a technology and then get deployed into the economy showed that it attenuated growth rates, and in some scenarios actually turned them negative around global trade. So I think it's important to ask these questions and wonder how these scenarios play out. I mean, I'm not saying they're the better or worse, but I think what we've observed with policymakers with respect to automation is that they have moved from saying, is automation good or bad, to saying automation is going to happen, now how do we deal with it? And I think we have to start to look at those sorts of questions with respect to national competition and national cooperation and globalization versus localization, and say what's kind of going to happen and where do we want to actually go, rather than stumbling our way into it.
Mm-hmm. How do we reconcile this kind of growing techno-nationalism and increasing national tension that we're observing with this concept of kind of corporate sovereignty versus national sovereignty? I mean, so okay, if to use a hypothetical tangible example, we've got the U.S. and China kind of fighting for quantum computing dominance. At the same time, you've got the Googles of the world who are more likely to be the ones really leading the charge in terms of developing those sorts of technologies. Google's, IBM's. How, and I guess as part of your thinking, nation states increasingly need to be kind of relating with large global corporates as sovereign bodies. How do you think about that dynamic?
Yeah, it's such an interesting dynamic. So I think there are two different things that are going on. One is that there's a class of problems that nation states now can't solve for their citizens. So WannaCry hits you. You can't call the police. They can't do anything about it. You can't call the army. You have to call Microsoft. And we're starting to see that particularly in sort of digital threats and the digital threat space, that it's up to the Cloudflares and the Googles and the Microsofts to be able to resolve the problem. And that those capabilities are underdeveloped nationally, and they will need to be developed more so. On the question of who will get there first and how do you play it out? I mean, this is a really interesting one, because what you've started to see increasingly is these large multinationals localize according to what the market they're pursuing needs or wants. So we've seen that with Facebook with respect to both WhatsApp in India, but in what it has or hasn't done in other markets in Southeast Asia. We've seen many of the social networks and the search engines adhere to Germany's hate speech policies, and you could imagine a model where these large multinationals become increasingly multipolar themselves. So the experience that you get in X market with Y service is different to what you get in Z market with Y service, because they are having to adhere more closely to certain rules. And the question, I think, then is, how do we start to look at these supranational entities that they're becoming? Now, the one company that I think is thinking really hard about this is Microsoft. Brad Smith is Microsoft's president, chief legal counsel. He's written quite a lot about these sorts of questions and about the responsibilities that Microsoft has. But at the end, these things are companies. Their governance is very, very particular. Doesn't feel like it's political governance. And so we have to think about how they relate given the powers that they now have. And, I think some countries are thinking about this quite hard. I mean, Denmark has an ambassador with full ambassador status, Kasper Kling, who is based in San Francisco with a team in Europe and in China to represent the nation of Denmark to these tech companies and vice versa.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
I think one of the one of the more, at least to me, kind of reflective points that you've made recently, and I guess it's kind of in the context of history repeating itself or rhyming or at the very least learning from kind of what's gone before us was I guess a prediction of yours that going forward we'll see a comeback of Marx, Hayek, Aristotle, and Buddha. This concept that we're seeing again, kind of mounting tension potentially between workers, employers, and providers of owners and providers of financial capital. A la what inspired Marx's original writings. Hayek's thinking around kind of the efficiency of markets, market operation. To what extent the kind of discovery and dissemination of information through decentralized platforms like blockchain can potentially validate some of those points, or does it end up falling short? Aristotle, from the kind of human flourishing standpoint, how do we kind of find a way to leverage this technology for good, as opposed to a way that kind of undermines some of our own best interests from an ethics standpoint and others, and then finally, Buddhist philosophy, at least, meditation, mindfulness, kind of maybe rediscovering the importance of our own consciousness as we kind of begin to interact with increasingly sophisticated, maybe eventually sentient machines. Wow, I'm gonna have to head back to the library, but
I have gone back to the library. When I wrote that, and I was thinking, do I really mean this? And I realized actually I do mean it, because I'm seeing so many more debates that are so ultimately fundamental, and if you've summed it up really well, so I'm not going to repeat it, and listeners should just rewind and listen to exactly what you've said. But I want to pull out just a kind of couple of points there. When it comes to this idea of eudaimonia and human flourishing, which is sort of Aristotle's idea, in the West in particular, we're incredibly wealthy. So in the US, GDP per capita is about $57,000 per year. And I had a conversation with the economist Jeff Sachs a year or so ago, and he pointed out to me that the average adult American is working 3 hours a day. So you take all the hours worked, you divide them by the number of adults, it comes to 3 hours a day. Now, some are working 15 hours a day and some are working none. But the fact is we're producing $55,000 of gross value add capital, if we're even measuring the right thing, and per person, and we're doing it on 3 hours a day. That is incredible. And yet opioid deaths are one of the highest causes of death for young men, and lifespans in the US are going down. They're going in the wrong way. So we've somehow lost track of the thing that we're measuring. People are there is a challenge of affluence, and people are not necessarily feeling as good as perhaps the indicators say they should be, and so there's a lot to be asked about. Are we looking at the right things or not? On the point about Buddha, I mean, I'm not a Buddhist. I've read a little bit about it, and I'm a occasional inconsistent meditator. But I just draw attention to kind of a couple of things. The first is that one of the rare things that we have is our own human attention. It's one of the reasons I have such a difficulty with Facebook as a product. We have about 15, 16 hours of attention a day because we sleep and the rest of the time. And we haven't figured out a way of increasing that. I mean, we do in total have a way of increasing it. It takes 9 months, and it's a very expensive process for the 15, 18 years after that. But it's slow to increase the stock of human attention. But you as an individual can't really increase your attention. I mean, not by manufacturing more time. You can increase the quality of your attention. And the challenge with a business like Facebook is that Facebook's entire business is about taking my attention, taking the one thing that I can't increase for its own benefit. And there are so many noises and signals and things that emerge. The best intentions of Apple with notifications on the iPhone, which result in hundreds of notifications. And I'm now one of those people who has essentially all of my notifications turned off, except for a few people and my boarding pass announcements when I'm at the airport. And so figuring out how to go back and reflect on ourselves and think more clearly in a time that is going to be more turbulent, for better or for worse, I think is really important. And so for the last sort of data point on all of that is I looked at I'm going to give you 2 data points. So the first is that if you look at the Headspace app, the Headspace has reported how many people consistently are meditating at that time. And that number has gone up 10, 15, 20-fold over the last 2 or 3 years. So more and more people are using this app. It's an early trend. How will it peter out? Yeah, maybe. The second thing that I've looked at is the number of peer-reviewed papers on mindfulness that have been written since the 1980s, and it has a hilarious sort of exponential curve. It looks like a startup business plan, one of the ones that goes up and to the right, because for whatever reason, people are finding this phenomenon interesting and they're looking into it. So I think that those are quite important themes, because now is not the time to be thoughtless about one's ability to shape the world. And you're either going to be part of the group that makes a consensus, so you're going to be the group that takes the rules.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I was catching up on some of Harari's work recently, and I think he's been talking about this concept of clarity as power, as opposed to the traditional information as power in this world in which we're so inundated with information, and that confusion tactics now often relate less to withholding information and more to overwhelming people with information. And that I think you've made a very similar point about effectively taking ownership of one's attention again and going deeper and for longer.
Well, he's quite amazing, Harari, and if people haven't read his books, I do recommend reading them. He meditates for a long time. I mean, I think he's a daily long meditator, but I also understand from when I spoke to him that he will go on month-long or longer meditation retreats to clear his mind, which is something that he's constructed his schedule to allow him to do. That idea of clarity as power is absolutely fantastic. In fact, an entrepreneur in London gave me this great phrase. She said to me, "Busy is the new stupid."
Love it.
Yeah. And I look at that and I think, I've just got to stop complaining that I'm busy.
Excellent. Where Azim, can people find out more about your work, sign up to your newsletter, listen to your podcast?
Yeah, so it's all under the catchy title of Exponential View. It's probably easiest to put it into Google or DuckDuckGo if you're privacy safe, and search for it that way. And you can find the podcast on iTunes and Spotify and Stitcher and all of the usual places. And by all means, drop me a note on Twitter on @Azim, although I'm quite irregular at replying to those.
Excellent. Well, I highly encourage everyone to become one of the, I think, more than 30,000 subscribers to your newsletter. Phenomenal work. Really, really phenomenal. Azim Azhar, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Will.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.